Welcome, everyone, to Professing Literature. This is David Anderson, and I'm joined by Eric Williams. And today we have something different for you. We're doing a retrospective episode. We feel like we've reached a bit of a transition point at Professing Literature as we begin a new series of episodes. Over the past year, we've released 10 episodes on various literary subjects, and we're gearing up to do a bunch more. And so we both thought it would be a nice way to transition by doing a little bit of reflecting on some of the works that we've talked about over the previous year and taking a few questions. So before too long, we hope you'll be able to download episodes from our new series, starting with one that's actually on a passage from the Gospels, a Bible and literature approach, and we've got some others planned, which we hope will follow soon. One thing I'm going to try to avoid doing, Eric, I have a major programming announcement. I'm going to try to stop talking every episode about how we're back and how we're finally going to do this thing and how it feels good to be finally settling in. One of our most loyal listeners, who happens to be married to me, mentioned that it was a little bit disconcerting to hear me basically go into that every time an episode started. So we're going to act like we've been here before. Our publishing schedule has not been as robust as we could have hoped in the past year. Eric and I both had a lot of demands on our time. We're both, how do I want to put this? We both have growing families, and the last year was especially busy for both of us in that regard, but it looks like we've got a little bit more of an orderly schedule opening up in front of us, and we want to take advantage of that by bringing more professing literature to you. So we're hoping, I think, Eric, we're thinking of 1 to maybe 2 episodes per month over the next year or so. Yeah. So not exactly coming at you on a daily basis, but then you probably don't need for us to be coming at you on a daily basis. Even I can only absorb so much literary criticism through my ear buds. But it is exciting to plan and look forward to some of the things that we can do episodes on. So let me say, as I always do, that you should please subscribe, rate, and review us. We would be very happy to count you among our subscribers on whatever podcast service floats your boat. And please be inspired today to follow some of your fellow listeners' examples and send us an email at professingliterature@protonmail.com. That's professingliterature@protonmail.com. And you can see that email address in the show notes. So, Eric, you have the questions in front of you. So what do we have? What are our listeners desperate to know?
Well, hear that.
Man,
that's
a thick stack.
Thick stack of papers. I've got all the power.
Mm-hmm.
So normally I'm sitting here just with my mouth wired shut.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that you don't
That's in
get
the
mad
contract.
at me. Yeah.
Yeah.
But now I've got all the power.
Oh.
Okay. So I've got some questions here that we've sourced from some listeners, and I think they're really great questions. So let's get started.
Lovely.
All right. So kind of, what's a brief history? What's your story? How did you come to be in Oklahoma, and how did the podcast come to pass?
Oh, okay. That's nice. I'll try to keep this fairly punchy because, you don't need to hear me go on for 10 minutes about my background. So I'm Canadian. I grew up in Canada and spent my whole life in Canada until age 31. At that point, I had finished my doctorate from McGill University. So this is 2008, 2009. McGill University in Montreal is where I got my PhD from, in their English department. And I had recognized long before that if I really wanted to be a professor or to try to be a professor, I would have to give up the idea that other people take for granted in different careers of being able to choose where I live, because that's just not how it happens in academia until you get to be a very big shot indeed. And I have to say, although this will come as a shock, I'm not quite that much of a big shot to be able to just pick the institution I'd like to work at. So I applied for every job that moved that year when I came on the job market, and there were about 30, 35 of them, something like that, across Canada and the US. And there were some great jobs and some lousy jobs advertised, and they all got an application packet from me. And I got a couple of campus interviews, meaning I was shortlisted at a couple of different institutions, including the University of Oklahoma. I had never considered Oklahoma as a place to live before. I thought of the musical and The Grapes of Wrath and the movie Twister. And so it's unfortunate for our great state that not all of its associations are so dazzling in the popular imagination. But I was offered the job by the University of Oklahoma to teach Renaissance literature. I was very fortunate to get that, and I immediately accepted it and moved here with some trepidation, thinking that I'd probably want to be moving back north again when I could, thinking that maybe in a few years I'd be able to apply for a job back north of the border. But those few years passed, and I realized I really loved my job and had grown to love the place. And a couple of years after that, I found myself married to a Texas girl. And a couple of years after that was the beginning of a large collection of children. And so in some ways, I feel more Canadian with each passing day. But in some ways, I really sort of identify with Oklahoma and love this place. And I know you, Eric, are also a transplant from the Washington, D.C. area.
Yeah.
So you're also someone who's recently settled here in Oklahoma.
Yeah, very similar. Came from D.C. Now, my wife was from Oklahoma originally, but we met out in D.C. and then moved here, and the whole family thing, which is when I think we met. So that would have been
2015, I think. Yep.
Yeah.
That was the year I was married.
Right.
I think.
That's right. That's right.
We were newlyweds that year. Yeah.
I remember thinking one time we were in a group and you were just talking, and see this, and this will go into like the evolution of the podcast. But I remember hearing you talk, and I told my wife, I said, "Man, I could just listen to David talk about anything. It's just got it's good voice. There's just something about it." So I filed that away for later when I I said, "What do you want to do? Do you want to do a podcast, David?"
And I said yes. Actually, as I recall, I think our wives, the first I knew of the idea was that our wives were talking, and my wife later told me that that your wife mentioned to her that you were thinking of this. And so I was kind of excited and started thinking about different ideas that might work for a podcast. And then finally we sat down one hot summer day, I think, on your porch at the extreme height of COVID tide, and sort of hammered out this idea. And recording the episodes has just been a consistent pleasure. And the teamwork has been nice too. I'll mention to the listeners that this is a real partnership. If I dropped off the face of the earth, I think it would take Eric about 5 minutes to find another half-smart academic who loves the sound of his own voice. Where I work, the merchandise is stacked to the ceiling and it is priced to move.
See that, but I think, and the opposite of that, I think that if I dropped off the face of the earth, you could just go find some other technical guy that could come in and, do all this editing and all that stuff for you.
People always talk as though that's easy. I think I'd be rubbing two sticks together, trying to get the electricals to float up into the interwebs, which, much like Senator Ted Stevens, I understand is a series of tubes. So I don't know if you remember that one from about 15 years ago, but that's a definition of the internet that works for me.
Yeah.
But well, anyway, we've got a good thing going here and we plan on doing more of it. So I think that probably only leaves our listeners desperate to know more. and, probably write in requesting signed headshots of both of us.
Yeah.
But I think most of them probably tuned in wondering if I had anything worthwhile to say about books. So,
well, but I do think,
what do you think, Eric?
I think people are just, they're curious about where you come from because of the Agains.
Yep.
Sorry. And what's one of the other ones?
All the sort of hosts and stuff like that.
So Figure. Do you do that one? The Figure. I know that.
I say figure. I think, although my pronunciation sometimes interests my students, and sometimes it is a matter of just Canadianisms, which are natural and ingrained.
Yeah.
It's also the product of what's sometimes called overpronunciation, which is what happens when you take a poor kid from the Ontario farm country and he tries to sort of half self-educate himself and he's sounding out words in his head. And so I've got all kinds of little quirks of pronunciation.
Interesting.
That don't fit in any kind of map.
Yeah.
And are, in many cases, it's what someone thinks an intelligent person is supposed to sound like. Yeah. And about 10 or 15 years ago, when I realized I did that, I thought, oh, Lord, and tried to sort of tone it down. But I think it's mostly stuck with me.
It's hard to correct. You've been doing it for so long.
Yeah, maybe if I'd caught myself at age 15 or something. But if that doesn't drive you, if that hasn't driven you away by now, then maybe you're all in for the long haul. So,
okay. Well, when we can jump to the first, let's go to the first episode, which is, it was our first published, but it is by far the most popular episode, Macbeth. And it's I love Macbeth. So first and foremost, and I may be also asking this for myself, but when people ask, when are we going to get more Macbeth?
More Macbeth. I'm open to that. I think my half-formed idea was that we'd maybe go to one of the other great tragedies first and do an episode perhaps on Lear. I don't object to tackling Macbeth again. If I'm a little nervous about it, it would only be because I think I went from this fairly focused reading of a single scene in Act 2 to, by the end of the episode, this sort of more sprawling account of the play in general. But if Macbeth is what the people want, then Macbeth is what they shall have. So we can probably work a Macbeth episode in this season. And probably at least one other Shakespeare as well. I think we did 2 Shakespeare episodes in our first series. And Shakespeare is the thing in all of literature that I feel most at home with. It's what I've spent the most time working on and probably the most time teaching. And so, perhaps it is time to revisit Macbeth.
Okay. A lot of people would be happy about that. All right, let's jump to Emma. Our episode on Emma.
All right.
Okay, so a common opinion is that Emma Woodhouse is not a very likable heroine. What do you think about that?
Well, I guess so. I love Emma. I love all of Austen's heroines. And I hope I'm not repeating myself from the Emma episode, where I believe I floated the thesis that after giving the most sort of sparkling and delightful heroine that anyone could give us in Elizabeth Bennet, Austen really got interested in sort of testing herself as a writer by presenting heroines who aren't just absolutely sparkling and full of very obvious intelligence and integrity. And Emma is in that group. Anne Elliot, the protagonist of her last novel, Persuasion, is a sad young woman who feels like life has passed her by, and some readers dislike her because she's too melancholic. I don't agree with them. Some readers dislike Fanny Price because they see her as a little bit mousy and dull. And I don't agree with them. And I think I think the majority who take issue with any of Austen's heroines probably take issue with Emma, and they see her as a prig, as someone who is controlling, and as someone who maybe does not show enough growth over the course of the novel. I've heard that said on a number of occasions, and I think it's one of those times when you wonder if you're reading a different book than the person you're talking to, and does remind us that these things are not scientific. You don't have to like any literary character if you don't want to, of course. And an author who tried to craft a character that would be universally loved to an equal degree by every possible reader would be a fool. Emma's shortcomings are there. They're obvious enough. She is controlling. She likes being in charge, probably more than is healthy for someone. She's proud. Of all of Austen's heroines, Emma is the one, and she's the highest born, so maybe this is natural, but she's the one who has the most sort of satisfaction from her relatively high rank in society. She is the leading gentlewoman in the little village of Highbury, and she knows it, and she likes it that way. And she's a little bit picky. Now, she's too well-bred and too smart to really wear that kind of thing on her sleeve, but the reader sees all kinds of indications that Emma does think that she is just, simply because of what her last name is and who her father is and who she is, that she's of a different kind than many of the people who are surrounding her. She's also an indulgent character. Austen jokes at her expense sometimes about how Emma is always coming up with ideas for sort of programs of study and moral reflection and things like that, and desires. You know, she's a capable musician and singer at the piano, but she's too indolent and lazy to really give it the kind of practice that would make her excellent. So she gets by on sort of talent and doesn't do what another character in the novel, who's very clearly set up as her foil, Jane Fairfax, does. Jane Fairfax is very poor, and she's very well educated, but she'll have nothing to do with her education unless she finds a man who she's happy to marry. She'll have nothing to do with her education, but to be a governess, someone who has to live in someone else's house and teach their children. And so Jane Fairfax doesn't waste a minute of the day and is very serious and very hardworking and a master of various subjects. And so next to her, Emma looks quite indulgent, even while she looks quite proud. I see Emma as really repenting very deeply in the last 50 or more pages of the novel, really inspecting herself and thinking about where she's gone wrong as she's very shaken up. Not everyone, I think, is satisfied with what Austen gives us of her moral reformation, but I am. When she hears that her friend Harriet is in love with Mr. Knightley, and that Harriet, quite naively, believes that Mr. Knightley loves her, Emma is shocked by this and horrified because she's only now realizing that she loves Mr. Knightley. She assumes that what Harriet says is true, and she takes the punch and doesn't offer any criticism of Harriet or try to manipulate or get in the way of that. She believes that it's natural, given how proud she is, that Mr. Knightley would not probably love her as much as Harriet. And so she's chastened, in my opinion, and chastening is interesting to me. I think the main point I would make about Emma, and again, if she's not your cup of tea, that's just fine, but I think it's important to remember that as a great writer, Austen's ambition is not to build the perfect character. Even Lizzie Bennet isn't the perfect character. Lizzie gets herself into trouble sometimes with her mouth. And yes, we root for her because she's so charming and because, our sympathy is just with her. But Austen isn't trying to suggest that Lizzie walks on water. Emma definitely does not walk on water. And Austen isn't trying to give us a character who we think will walk on water. Austen, I think you could say, is trying to offer a depiction of someone with her own realistic psychology, her own set of virtues and vices, strengths and weaknesses, who is nevertheless struggling to be good and find happiness aided by some of her strengths and inhibited by some of her weaknesses. And then Emma really exemplifies what is one of Austen's, I think, major preoccupations, which is the struggle that all of us have to undergo, which should be our first priority, but so often isn't. The struggle against self-deception, about the fact that we all mislead ourselves and kid ourselves about our own motives and our virtues and our intentions and our superiority, and how we're so much more humble than that other guy over there. Austen's really interested and really sees it as an enormous moral priority that we challenge ourselves and learn to see ourselves and other people truly with an awareness of what's driving us and motivating us. And I think Emma is a good representative of that. So I don't know if that convinces anyone or gives Emma a break in anyone's eyes, but that's what I think about Emma.
Okay. Let's jump to 1984.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Is there any hope in this novel?
Is there any hope in 1984? No, I think. I think it is just about as hopeless a book as I've ever read. And I remember being really shaken when I read it the first time as a young man at how hopeless it was. I think it's pretty close to being a statement of absolute despair. And it's impressive that Orwell managed to craft a book that has been read by tens of millions of people and is considered one of the greatest novels of the 20th century that is so despairing. Animal Farm, his other very, very famous work, the allegory of the farm animals who sort of invent their own form of revolutionary socialism. Animal Farm is maybe pretty helpless in the way it ends as the pigs come to look like humans and the humans come to look like pigs. But that book is such a satire that we are laughing along the way. And we're not thinking of, we know this is a book about talking animals. We're not thinking about them as real people in the same way. I've heard 1984 called a satire. I think many people will kind of suggest that as though to say, well, it's not meant to be taken straight. And so therefore, I guess, let a smile be your umbrella, reader of 1984. And I just don't buy that. I think it's a story of a man who's torn apart by an evil system. The reader is gulled, like Winston Smith is gulled for 2/3 of the novel, into thinking that something hopeful might happen. And Winston's rebellion is crushed, but it's crushed in a way that makes him believe that all rebellions are destined to be crushed. And he realizes that the party, this totalitarian state which claims these sort of vaguely socialist principles, is not full of well-meaning but cruel people who go a bit too far and who have created an unjust system in spite of their good intentions. He learns that the party, at least according to its deep initiates, is only about control and power and using force to destroy enemies, and that there's nothing more to it than that. And so all the principles are seen as simply a screen. By the end of the novel, Winston, throughout the book, has maintained to himself privately, famous line by Orwell, that freedom is the freedom to say 2 + 2 = 4. All else follows from that, Winston writes at one point. And it's a great statement. In other words, the basis of freedom is being able to recognize and state the truth of objective reality. By the end of the book, Winston has been tortured and broken down psychologically so that he is able, simply as a coping mechanism, to fool himself into thinking that 2 + 2 can = 5. If he needs if the party wants him to think that. The last lines of the book are the most chilling. He loved Big Brother. By the end of the novel, Winston has utterly abandoned himself and his ability to live in, what you might think of the smallest but most deepest freedom, the freedom to have our own thoughts. He doesn't even get those anymore. He's so broken. People will make arguments to try to find silver linings in 1984. Orwell published an appendix to the book, which is an essay about Newspeak, the language he invented. And I've seen people seize on a single throwaway sentence in the appendix that says, Newspeak was the official language of Oceania in the time of Winston Smith. It goes something like that. And they'll say, was. That suggests that this appendix is being written from the point of view of a sort of post-revolutionary or a period when the party has been overthrown, and some future historian of the party can look and say it was this way, but it's implying that it's not that way anymore. I think, if that's a strong enough hook for you to hang your hope on, congratulations. I don't think that does it for me. I think the one way in which you can see a sense of optimism in 1984 is that it's a warning by Orwell. The world in the late 1940s, when he was writing the novel, was not yet at the point that of the society of the totalitarian, authoritarian, absolutist society he was imagining. And he had hopes that his book could alert people to the danger of the kind of tyranny that he saw taking shape in the world. And so there's something optimistic about that Orwell thought that the book might be able to make a difference, and that things might not, that this presentation of a hopeless world that's been destroyed by totalitarianism might protect the world, or at least parts of the world, and keep a certain amount of freedom and human dignity around. And I do think, Orwell's, this is a book that's haunted many people's minds, people on both the left and the right, with a sense of the danger that we might pose to ourselves. So I'll say that in that sense, you could see 1984 as kind of a hopeful novel. I think perhaps you could say if Orwell thought that within a generation, it was inevitable that a tyranny like the one he imagined could befall the Western democracies, he might not have written the book in the first place. There might have been no point.
Interesting. So it's almost like the hope comes when you read the last sentence of the book and you put it down and you realize, thank God.
Yeah.
that
never in this man's America. Something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see. Let's jump to Beowulf. And this listener asks, is it correct to call this an epic poem?
Beowulf, an epic poem. Yeah, that's interesting. It is and it isn't. It's perfectly reasonable to refer to Beowulf as an epic poem if you're using the term loosely, recognizing that the more technical meaning of epic poem doesn't fit quite right on Beowulf. If you've got a stricter, more technical definition of epic, which is a natural enough thing, at least for a literary critic to hold, then you're thinking of something that Beowulf fits in some ways, but maybe not in others. An epic has to be by its nature long. That's the first criterion of an epic poem, is that it is long. And the classical epics of ancient Greece and Rome are much longer than Beowulf. Beowulf is 3,000-4,000 lines long. Homer's epics and Virgil's Aeneid are well over 10,000 lines. The classical epic is also episodic. In other words, a number of things happen in a kind of series, a series of events. There's sort of one thing after another, and Beowulf isn't quite that way. It kind of is. There's sort of two phases to the poem, among the Danes and then back home with the Geats, and then there's three monsters. But it's not episodic in the way the Odyssey is episodic. And the epic poems from classical antiquity have a particular structure, which Beowulf doesn't really have. Classical epics have what are called topoi, certain tropes that recur that sometimes recur in both the Iliad and the Odyssey, Homer's two epic poems, and are also picked up by Virgil in the Aeneid and deliberately sort of used by him, because Virgil, writing at a time when the Greek epics were 700 or 800 years old, wanting to write his own Latin epic poem, sort of self-consciously emulated some of the devices in Homer's epics. And so we have things like heavenly councils among the gods. We have arming scenes where the warriors' weapons and armor are described. We have games and contests, athletic games that pop up in these poems, and that also pop up in the epic of a much later writer like John Milton. As he's writing his Christian epic Paradise Lost, Milton is very self-consciously modeling after Homer and Virgil, especially Virgil. And so those topoi recur in Milton. We have certain structural things that the epics share. They begin with invocations to a god, or to the muse, the daughter of a god and a goddess. In the case of Homer and Virgil, in the case of Milton, he invokes the Holy Spirit as his muse. So you have these structural things that repeat, and Beowulf doesn't do that. And of course it wouldn't, because the author of Beowulf, whoever he is, probably knew next to nothing about the classical epic tradition and was writing his own poem in a way that suited the cultural expectations of his own readership. So in a technical sense, you can't call Beowulf an epic poem. J.R.R. Tolkien, who's one of the most important writers to ever talk about Beowulf, in his essay, The Monster and the Critics, he calls Beowulf not an epic, but a heroic elegy. In other words, the stress on the heroic culture and the heroic presentation of the protagonist, it has that in common with classical epics. But for Tolkien, there's a key issue of tone. And I think we got a certain ways towards unpacking this in our episode on Beowulf, that there's a tone of melancholy and lamentation that you don't see dominating the Aeneid or the Iliad, even though the Iliad ends sadly with Priam begging for his son Hector's body to be given back to him by Achilles. The tone of the poem as a whole isn't shot through with melancholy, whereas Beowulf really is. Beowulf is not just a story about monsters that has some sad bits in it. It is really a lament for the passing away of all things. And so Tolkien's word elegy is a very apt one. But you can quite properly, I think of Beowulf as an epic if you're being a little looser with the term, or if you're aware that you're being a little bit looser with the term. In that way, it fits in with a group of poems that includes the classical epics and a sort of self-conscious modern epic like Paradise Lost, but also includes things like Dante's Divine Comedy, or the Epic of Gilgamesh, as it's known, this long Sumerian poem, Sumerian or Akkadian poem that's thousands of years older than Homer. These are poems that stress an individual hero who's a kind of cultural representative, an exemplary figure. It's investigating the nature of heroism and also the nature of existence, all of these poems do, depicting a kind of crisis in society or in the heavens even, and a poem that encapsulates the core values of its society. Beowulf doesn't just happen to be this 3,000-line poem in which some interesting things happen. It's really defining the Anglo-Saxon worldview and the Anglo-Saxon understanding of heroism and virtue in the face of their pretty grim worldview. Beowulf is also, some of you may know, an old distinction that I first came across in C.S. Lewis's book on Paradise Lost, and I think Lewis coined these terms, but I could be wrong, so correct me if I'm wrong. The terms primary and secondary epic. When you understand what Lewis meant by primary epic, Beowulf fits well for certain reasons within that. Lewis says the primary epic almost seems to emerge from the ground. It's a kind of naturally occurring thing, or at least it feels that way to later generations. There's no sense of an author. These poems are, we may traditionally ascribe the Iliad and the Odyssey to Homer, but we don't know anything about Homer and don't even know if he really existed. Instead, we have this poem that feels like it was born in the hall of a king, of a petty king, or around the campfire in a little farming community. A poem that was not meant to be written down and read, but that was transmitted orally, that would have been sung by a kind of bardic figure accompanied by his harp. And Beowulf comes out of that same kind of cultural generation process. And so Lewis contrasts that idea of the primary epic with the secondary epic represented by Virgil in the Aeneid, where you do have a clear author, a historical figure. And we understand the poem as being very much the product of his creative mind. And the poem would maybe the Aeneid originally would probably have been read in excerpts to audiences, but it was also something that could be read privately, and Paradise Lost was certainly something that could be read privately. So Beowulf can be fitted in this matrix fairly well, but someone who cares about terminology like a literary critic necessarily has to do needs to be aware that the fit is a kind of imperfect and sort of improvisational one. So I hope that answer made sense and wasn't too dull and technical, but that's what I have to say about Beowulf as an epic.
Okay. The Catcher in the Rye. This is
Catcher.
Probably our third or fourth most popular episode. And just real quick, I was just looking at that. Obviously, Macbeth, I said, was number one. The Emma episode, I think, would be number 2. Catcher in the Rye was third, but then Proof Rock,
no kidding,
the first episode, surpassed that.
All right. Good for Proof Rock.
Anyway, people are still listening to them. We're gaining listeners all the time. And that's the other thing, too, real quick, before we jump back to the last couple questions.
I love this stuff.
I can't believe how many people we've had just outside of the United States listening to the podcast. It's amazing. It's amazing.
It is kind of cool to think that you might be sitting in traffic in New Delhi or something like that, listening to some egghead in Oklahoma. So yeah, thank you to all of you who are interested in this from all 4 corners of the globe. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's very cool. Okay, let's jump to The Catcher in the Rye. Can you talk about the style of the novel? Holden's voice is so distinctive, and I hadn't realized it was supposed to be coming out of a therapy session.
Yeah, The Catcher in the Rye is The Catcher in the Rye because of that voice. That's what makes it the novel it is. You think about the difference between, say, Austen and Dickens and their voices, their sort of authorial voices, and there are differences between them. Austen's is simply crisper. Dickens is more kind of, Dickens kind of enjoys his own writing more than Austen does. Austen's is kind of cut glass and precise. Her wit is acerbic. Dickens' wit is more, it can be satirical, but it's more generous. But they're fairly close. The Catcher in the Rye is really like nothing else, at least in that sense of voice. Holden's sort of sensibility pervades the book. And of course it would, because this is his rant. And yeah, I don't know if it's a universally agreed upon thesis, although I think it probably is, the idea that this story is coming to us from a therapy session. There are a couple of moments in the text, I want to say 2 or 3, which when you add them all up, you can infer that Holden is on the West Coast. So this native New Yorker has been sent to the West Coast by his parents because of the stuff that happened a few months ago. that he's in Southern California. We know that because his brother-in-law, or his brother, not brother-in-law, his brother DB, he mentions comes to visit him sometimes. And DB lives in Hollywood, where he's working as a writer for the movie studios, a fact that Holden hates. But DB comes to visit him sometimes. And so we know Holden right now is close to him. And there are just a few references later on where he says phrases like, since I got to this place, or now that I'm talking to you, which give us the sense of this character having to, or maybe complying with the requirement that he tell his story, that he explain himself to someone who's in a position of care. So there are maybe a few different explanations that could fit that, but the most obvious one, especially when you consider that it's the middle 20th century and that Holden is the child of fairly wealthy elite parents, the explanation that makes sense is that he's in some kind of a sanitarium, some kind of a place where people who've been through psychological traumas or crises can go. I wouldn't say rehab, because I don't think that's a mid-20th century idea, really. And although Holden abuses alcohol, he doesn't seem to do it in a way that suggests he has alcohol dependency so much that he's just a combination of irresponsible and sad. But he's in some kind of care center, and he's telling his story. He seems to be comfortable enough with the setting and with the person he's talking to that he can be candid. Holden is an unreliable narrator in that he gets confused sometimes, and he's a little bit blind to his own hang-ups, and he just doesn't know everything. But I don't think he's an unreliable narrator in the sense that we have hints that he's trying to deceive. He's pretty candid. There's the feeling of someone who's sort of bottomed out, whose attitude is, all right, what do you want to know? I'll tell you. And he talks a lot. He talks, the Caulfield style involves a lot of slang, a certain amount of cursing. It involves a lot of tangents. It involves a lot of jokes. It involves a lot of insults towards himself. He's very self-deprecating. It involves the vernacular. And very particular turns of phrase that I've always found really sort of winsome and charming about Holden. Other people might just think they sound kind of stagey or affected maybe, but I think if you were a teenager in the 1940s, I suspect you'd say Salinger had a pretty good ear for the way at least some teenagers could talk. And so that's turns of phrase like some I mentioned in that episode, what it means to give someone the time. Some of Holden's formulations, he's always using the word old. He refers to his little 10-year-old or 11-year-old sister Phoebe as old Phoebe, which I think is really charming. And they give this sense of a very particular voice. And so this style and Holden's way of speaking go towards what you could call individuation. The fact that Salinger is doing a damn good job of giving us the sense that this character is one person and not another. He's not every man. His experience may have aspects about it that are universal. I think that's a completely defensible proposition. But it's his experience with some universal struggles rather than yours or mine or somebody else's. He is one person and not another, and so his language roots him in a time and place. It's a dangerous thing for an author to do because, if you know anything about, if you're familiar with, say, certain Kipling's poems or even Shakespeare's clown scenes in a play like Much Ado About Nothing or something like that, you know that an author can risk alienating a later audience by being too particular about the foibles of the little slice of society he's depicting or dramatizing. I think Shakespeare and Kipling have done just fine in spite of that potential risk. And I think Salinger does too. We've got this kid who's got the markers of a certain class, got a fair amount of education, but he's alienated from his educational institutions, and he's alienated to a certain extent from his class. He's also, as I think I said when we talked about the book, he's both a member of and also alienated from or uncomfortable within the emerging youth counterculture that was going to be more and more important in the 50s and then especially the 60s. He's not quite comfortable with the post-war ethos. He doesn't want to go back to some more strict form of traditionalism, but at the same time, he's ill at ease in his own milieu. And so much of this comes not from the sheer content of what Holden tells us, but the way in which he tells us. And so if that voice is frustrating to you because it seems to be too full of kind of tics and antiquated turns of phrase, fair enough. But I think if you try to think about it in terms of why would Salinger stress that so much, what does it give him in terms of the story he's writing to make that such a point of emphasis, then I think you can appreciate the artistry there.
Okay, so I think we have about time for one more question. And just listeners, feel free to send in your questions anytime to us.
Bring it on.
Yeah. ProfessingLiterature@protonmail.com. Send in your questions, and you too can ask David questions.
Man, what a feeling that must be.
Okay, so let's go back to Macbeth. We had another question. It's an interesting question. How would you stage the play? We heard about a recent Broadway production of Macbeth starring Daniel Craig that has no real staging, and the characters wear street clothes.
So how would I stage the play? This is always a good question to float in a Shakespeare class. You can gin up a pretty good conversation about the play if you ask this. I remember this is going back so many years. It's probably my favorite ever Onion article that just really tickled me because of what I do. But the headline of this Onion article was something like "Maverick Theater Director Stages Production of Merchant of Venice in the time and place Shakespeare intended." And the article went on to say that this free-thinking radical theater director had this crazy idea of setting the Merchant of Venice in 16th century Venice. And isn't that an off-the-wall thing to do? And the joke, of course, is that every director, or at least countless directors, want to be original. And so the article is saying things like, while we're used to seeing Shylock in his traditional pinstripe banker's suit, the actors were impressed at how enlightening it was to actually costume him as a 16th century Venetian Jew. And so I guess if I found that funny, it probably means I'm in the right profession, because I did find it funny. I have no problem with modernizing costumes and sets. I have no problem with a Macbeth that's set in kind of 1930s gangster costuming and setting, things like that. Sometimes it gets a little bit loopy and a little bit out there, but it's fine with me. Shakespeare's Julius Caesar is obviously a story coming from Plutarch's Life of Caesar and Life of Brutus. And it's set in ancient Rome, but we know that Shakespeare's actors would not have been wearing togas and breastplates. They would have been dressed like Elizabethan gentlemen. That's the world they knew. Why wouldn't the Romans dress like that? They didn't have coffee table books of Roman archaeology to make clear what Roman dress codes were like or dress norms were like. So it's always a little bit artificial to say that a play has to be staged and set in a very particular way. I've seen modernized productions of plays or productions where the costuming was from a much later era that I think have worked beautifully. I saw a performance of Hamlet. I think it's still the greatest single Shakespeare performance I've ever attended. This is back in about 2006 or 7 in Stratford, Ontario, at the Summer Shakespeare Festival there. And the costuming was all kind of 19th century, and it was beautifully done. I've seen other kind of modernizations of the sets and the costumes that I think are disastrous and self-indulgent and ridiculous and just a bridge too far. For me, the key issue, I guess I would say a couple of things. I would say when in doubt, I'd rather keep it simple and I'd rather keep it fairly traditional, notwithstanding the fact that there are lots of brilliant exceptions to that. But I think that's my center of gravity. But what really matters, whether, you've got a play like Macbeth, you could set it like, ostensibly Macbeth is a story that comes from 11th century Scotland. So it's further removed from Shakespeare's day than we are from his. So you could really set the play in 11th century Scotland and have the characters wearing chainmail and carrying arming swords and big kite shields and things like that and stomping around and have a real kind of stark, severe kind of earlier medieval aesthetic. Or you could stage Macbeth in an Elizabethan context where they're all dressing like Elizabethans in their doublets and hose and breeches and lace ruffs and things like that, slashed doublets with the white shirt coming through. That would be just fine. Often Macbeth will be set in sort of not the early Middle Ages and not the Renaissance, but the kind of later Middle Ages, which is the Middle Ages that aesthetically is most familiar to us, a little bit more of a polished, both in terms of architecture and clothing and food and everything, polished and sophisticated Middle Ages. That's fine. Or you can take Macbeth and put him in the Second World War or put him in 2022. I saw a performance of Macbeth once that I thought was kind of a mixed success. It was okay. That was set in an African nation, an undisclosed African nation, shortly after the end of the colonial period. And so in some ways that worked really well aesthetically because they had certain things like tribal drumming and stuff like that that was really suggestive and worked well for the play. The problem, and this leads into the last thing I would say about this issue, the problem was that in that particular performance, that although I think the idea was really good, it was directed in a way that was just too self-conscious. I want my Shakespeare director to draw attention to the play rather than to his own creative genius. I'm not interested in productions that take the play and use it as the basis for, as someone's resume, or use words like experimental and things like that. I'm interested in the play, and there are innumerable ways of staging and arranging a play that could all work great and that could all make for really compelling theater. And I want you to choose one of those rather than one of the ones that emphasizes sort of new and innovative directorial curveballs. So, yeah, you can dress up Macbeth any way you like, put him in a hockey jersey or 19th century frock coat or whatever it is. But I want to be thinking about Macbeth. Thank you very much. So there we are on that one.
Hear, hear.
All right.
Great. Though, did you ever see the Romeo and Juliet with Leo DiCaprio?
Yeah. I would have been absolutely in the target demo for that. It was towards the end of high school for me when it came out, and I was starting to really like Shakespeare at that point, and I thought it was great. I might have been partly just because I don't know if I was smitten with Claire Danes, really liked some of the music, thought the style was really compelling.
Style was good.
And so that was mostly successful. It was, it turned it into a little bit too much of a teen crush movie. Like Romeo and Juliet is about a teen crush.
Right. But
it's also assuming that these two precocious people are sort of, I think, operating in a certain higher register than the average teen idols. Right. But that was, nowadays I would look back on that and probably wince from time to time. There were some awesome, the actor, I think he was in Lost, who played Mercutio, was fantastic. Pete Postlethwaite, who played Friar Lawrence, was fantastic. I love the character of Friar Lawrence, and he did a really nice job on that. And the two leads were good. But, I think the direction was, on the whole, I think they did what they set out to do.
Yeah.
And so I think I'd score them as winning on my scorecard, I think, with some reservations.
My biggest gripe with the movie is when you're going to take on Shakespeare, each role, the actors have a giant task because you need to understand what it is you're saying. Yeah. And I think that there were admissions even at the time from some people. They're like, "Oh no, we just learned these lines."
That's disappointing.
But I mean, I guess we think about it from a big movie budget. They've got a certain amount of time.
Yep.
Realistically, are you going to, teach a whole class on Romeo and Juliet so everybody knows? But that is so important. That's what they would do in a play.
Yeah.
You would know exactly the context of using certain words or phrases, stuff like that. You know it.
Yeah.
And it really does make a big difference, even for the audience, because there's a lot of stuff that the audience hears. They don't know what it is, but with the acting and the good actor and they can speak the lines, you can get
they discover they know what it is.
Yeah.
That's right. I think the school of Shakespearean acting that I find the most sort of resonant and that I agree with, that comes from people like John Barton from a generation or two or three ago in Britain, emphasizes understanding the sense of a passage and the thought process that the character is engaged in. And then the belief is that if you do that as an actor, then the poetry, the rhythm, the effort at naturalization and everything, all of that mostly takes care of itself if you emphasize the actor really being able to not to perform an emotion and not to just offer this sort of flourishy rendition of naturally flourishy language, but to think about what is being said. Prioritizing that makes for good performance. And so, it's probably not a surprise that some of the folks in that production had maybe laid less stress on really understanding the sense. That'd be a kind of boring work week, I would think, just going in and memorizing these words that didn't mean anything to you and spouting them. But I can't remember. It's been so long since I watched that. But if I trip over it again and watch it, I think I'm teaching Romeo and Juliet next year, so maybe I'll dust that off and look at it and see if that stands out.
Okay, well, I think it's about all the time we have for questions.
All right.
So last thing on the agenda before we go is upcoming shows.
Well, man, I don't want to make too many promises because, as Eric knows, I've got a habit, maybe a bad habit, of changing my mind sometimes as the hour approaches for us to do a recording. I'll have one idea and I'll carefully inform him exactly what the passage is, and then I'll play bait and switch with him. Can tell you for sure that our next episode, the first episode of Series 2, will be on the New Testament, on a passage from Luke's Gospel. And we've already recorded that one, and I think we're pretty satisfied with it. Before very long, I want to do the Brontes. I think it will probably be a passage from Jane Eyre. Might also do Emily's Wuthering Heights this season. Again, please don't hold me to any of this, or hold me to it if you want. If you really want Wuthering Heights, then you should damn well register your opinion and
let us know.
Make sure I'm in no doubt about it. There's some, I think we'll do Alfred Tennyson probably. We might do one or another of the Cavalier poets of the mid-17th century who I quite like. We'll probably, at some point, we'll have to come to Dickens and maybe come to him and come back to him and come back to him again. And Eric and I were talking a little while ago. We're both devoted lovers of Lord of the Rings. So the Lord of the Rings might have to get featured this season. I've got a few vague ideas for possible passages, and I think Eric has some thoughts too. So we'll kick that around. So there's sure to be a couple of authors who I haven't even thought of yet that are going to make it on the list. But that's a little bit of a foretaste of what is likely going to come. So,
And Shakespeare?
yes, yeah, that's right. I think we've got to continue with more Shakespeare and keep him in the mix fairly regularly. So that might mean next up will be Macbeth again, or like I say, one of the other great tragedies. But yeah, we'll never get too far from Shakespeare.
Okay. All right. That sounds great.
Well, good.
I'm excited.
All right. Well, as always, it's a pleasure, Eric, and thank you all for listening. On behalf of Eric Williams, I'm David Anderson. Thank you.